Greetings, fellow conspirators. It is I, LG Grande, and you are a liberty conspirator. If you believe in liberty, because, of course, freedom is out of fashion nowadays. Find us on YouTube under Liberty Conspiracy, on BitChute under Liberty Conspiracy, and on Facebook, as long as they haven't found us first, under Liberty Conspiracy. Find us on Twitter. Nah, don't find us on Twitter. As I've mentioned in a few previous videos, we aren't on Twitter, but I am on Twitter. If you want to contact me, it's @GuardGoldsmith on Twitter. And again, as we start, I want to thank everybody for your great support. And remember, it's up to us to try to circumvent the algorithms that will suppress something titled Liberty Conspiracy with content that is pro-liberty. So, if you want to stand up for freedom, tell a couple friends about our videos. Please like and subscribe if you're just discovering us. Ask those friends to do the same, and then ask them to ask others to do the same. To spread the word, share everywhere you possibly can, whether it be Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, anywhere you can. Please do so. Email these links to friends and family members and neighbors as well. Fellow co-workers, please do that. We really appreciate it. All right, everybody, you know what it's time for? It's time for a Liberty Conspiracy News Scan. And we will start off with our list. First off, a story we'll revisit towards the end. It is on the Supreme Court level, and of course that is the so-called constitutional level, although all of that is really just a big farce nowadays, and you'll see it was pretty much a farce when they first started as well. First off, John Roberts again allies with leftists to okay California Governor Newsom's crackdown on freedom of religion, association, and many other aspects of liberty that are supposed to be protected by the U.S. Constitution. Number two, another story that actually traces way back in history, but we can look at the contemporary issue first. Trump to send U.S. troops into cities and states under the Insurrection Act? How does this link to illegitimate action by George Washington and Alexander Hamilton and a Supreme Court justice in 1794? And why is it A, unconstitutional, B, unethical and immoral, and C, why, I might add, does it have something to do with why many of the people who were originally involved with the American Revolution viewed the U.S. Constitution and many of the backers of it as a usurpation and as usurpers of the original Articles of Confederation and a much more freedom-oriented setup for the United States, plural. Third, Minneapolis cops shoot paintballs at people standing on their own front porch. And then we'll return back to one. Further details via my piece from MRC TV. And I will mention, everybody, that if you are so inclined, Kevin Klein, please head over to MRC TV because you will find a video all about this first issue either tonight, that being June 1st, or Tuesday, June 2nd, via the great team at MRC TV who are nice enough to allow me to do work for them. Here's our first headline. Headline, John Roberts sides with leftist justices. Okays California's COVID crackdowns on churches. Again, just to give you a first blush, instantaneous look at this, and we'll look at this in more detail towards the end. In fact, I'll give you most of this piece. In a 5-4 majority decision, Friday night, late Friday night, everybody, this was done intentionally to hide it from the public, displaying more traps and holes than a pro golf course. SCOTUS Chief Justice John Roberts Friday night sided with the leftists on the bench to rule against California churches seeking an injunction against Governor Gavin Newsom's lockdowns and restrictions on attendance. It's a ruling that echoes Roberts' shocking 2012 vote with leftists claiming to determine the so-called constitutionality of Obamacare's individual mandate and its penalty. Just to remind you about that, a little brief time warp. Yeah, we're going to do the time warp again. If you recall, or maybe you were too young at the time, as Obamacare was being pushed, nobody really knew what was going on. And of course, Nancy Pelosi said, well, we have to pass the bill in order to see what's in the bill. This 1,000-page monstrosity, typical of them. But the Obama administration was very defensive because a lot of Republicans and libertarians, justly so, were saying that this thing has a penalty for people. It was the individual mandate. You had to have health insurance. And people were saying, never before in U.S. history were people being penalized or going to be penalized for something that they didn't have, that the government would force them to buy something. I mean, talk about fascism, right? So the Obama administration said, well, sweetie, that's the entire administration, voiced through Barack Obama. Well, Bramflake, it's not a penalty, it's a tax. It's not a floor wax, it's a dessert topping, like Saturday Night Live's great skit on what was that, Mop and Shine or something like that? It was hilarious. Very early days of Saturday Night Live. So they said it's not a penalty, it's a tax. And then people sued, saying, no, this is not right. The only way that the Supreme Court could hear the case was if John Roberts and a bunch of people, they wanted to hear the case so that they could make up this decision that it's perfectly acceptable. The only way they could hear the case was if they did not describe it as a tax, but instead described it as a penalty. And this is why. It goes back to something from the late 18th century called the Anti-Injunction Act. So the tax had not been collected, so therefore they called it a penalty in order to hear it. And then when they put it through the court, they said, oh no, it's not a penalty, it's a tax. And so therefore they sneaked it in the back door to get around the Anti-Injunction Act by calling it a penalty, contrary to what the Obama administration wanted people to think. But the only way they could get it in was to call it a penalty. And then they said, yeah, this isn't a penalty, it's actually a tax, and it's perfectly fine to be applied by the already existing IRS. That's how they got away with it. Now, this has since been questioned by circuit courts and struck down. But this is how Roberts and his gang got away with this. Okay? This is extremely important to remember, the Anti-Injunction Act. And curiously enough, ironically enough, the story from California is that these people were asking for an injunction and they had been penalized. They had suffered because they had already been closed down, and they were asking for an injunction to stop this from being done anymore by Gavin Newsom. They had already felt the pain. It perfectly fits the Anti-Injunction Act. And I'll just remind people that if they're wondering about how this all works, in the Constitution, and this is just on the constitutional level, not on a voluntarist level, which is deeper on freedom, because the Constitution is not a valid contract. I never signed it. You never signed it. It's forced on people, okay? It's just basically the way the slave masters promise you they'll treat you as you have no escape, and then they tell you you agreed to it. I mean, it's just absurd. It's totally illogical. However, and it's completely immoral. However, my fallback position, rather than if I could get straight voluntarism, that'd be great, but I would be semi-satisfied if they could at least get closer to the constitutional strictures. And then I'd be even more satisfied if they broke it up even more into semi-autonomous states and went with the Articles of Confederation. And you'll see in a moment why the Articles of Confederation supporters saw the Constitution as a usurpation, and that they saw many of the Federalists as usurpers. So that is a quick bit of information about what's going on right now. And I'll give you more information on the ground about the particular story out of California and the right of religion, the right of free expression, the right of voluntary association, the rights to actually open up your business and to have contracts fulfilled. All that is being crushed by Gavin Newsom. Now, I want to next turn to our other big story, which I think is extremely important. I heard on ABC News tonight that Donald Trump is threatening to deploy U.S. military forces to halt the violent riots, as they call these violent protests, No, they're not violent protests. They're riots and looting. That's what they are. People who are protesting this don't want to be seen as violent protesters. They're honest protesters who might have some valid gripes about, and in fact, they have many valid gripes. But I'm saying to the reporters, hey, guess what? You might want to consider that these people aren't violent protesters. There's a difference between a protester and a looter and a rioter in most cases, right? Don't allow the rioters and looters to hide under the cloak of honest protesters. How about that? How about you do that, ABC? And Martha Raddatz was the one who reported that Donald Trump might invoke, you got it, the Insurrection Act. And that's another big one that goes back to the 1800s, 200 years plus. And how is it done? Well, we'll do that in a minute. But I just want to mention Martha Raddatz is one of the most insufferable, hawkish, deep state flacks I've ever seen. I don't think this woman has ever seen a U.S. military operation that she doesn't like or a deep state operation that she doesn't adore. It is just vile. So Trump threatens to deploy U.S. military unless states halt violent protests. Now, what is this all about? It's about the Insurrection Act of 1807. This is the Wiki-Millie, military wiki. The Insurrection Act of 1807 is a United States federal law. That's the Title 10 of the U.S. United States Code, as you can see. And it governs the ability of the President of the United States to deploy military troops within the United States to put down lawlessness, insurrection, and rebellion. Now, check this out. This will show you how off base people can be when they accept basic premises that are faulty. The general purpose of this Insurrection Act of 1807, they tell us today, is to limit presidential power, relying on state and local governments for initial response in the event of insurrection. Now, if you just listen to Martha Raddatz, if you just watch Donald Trump, if you just saw the reports about violence and things happening in all sorts of cities based on the violent protesters, the looters and rioters, all stemming from upset and anger over possible police attacks on people and alleged murder, which seems pretty clear, by a police officer in Minneapolis, and seen as a racial thing, although if you actually do some research, you can find all sorts of examples of police misconduct committed against all sorts of different kinds of people, all colors, all creeds, all races, sometimes black on black cops against people, white on white, Hispanic against Hispanic. So breaking this down as purely racial might be a misstep. It might have to do more deeply with the very imbalance of the state claiming authority over you. Maybe that's a place to look as the root cause of the problem. And from there, you can start to explore things in more depth. However, if people feel they have legitimate gripes about racial discrimination and attacks by the cops, let them feel free to protest, right? Well, we'll see in another story that that isn't the case in Minneapolis and many other cities. And of course, under the Cowabunga 19, we know that many people have been forbidden from protesting those crackdowns as well, for their own good, of course. However, if you only took this on its superficial level, as it is explained here, to limit presidential power, one would think that this is justified presidential power. And maybe it might be wise to turn to the United States Constitution to find out whether it is legitimate presidential power according to the rule book, as they tell us. Because you'll see in Article 4, Section 4, the United States government already restricts the president from being able to use troops in states. The only way a president can employ troops inside states is if state legislators ask the president or the United States government to enter, to protect a Republican form of government or stop domestic violence. Here is the pertinent section. The United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a Republican form of government and shall protect each of them against invasion. And that is answered by a declaration of war, or if it's not a state actor, the Congress can issue letters of marque and reprisal. And inside, on application of the legislature or of the executive, when the legislature cannot be convened against domestic violence. That's not application of the federal legislature. That's application of the state legislature or the executive of the state when the legislature can't be convened against domestic violence. This is precisely the situation we're seeing now. The Insurrection Act of 1807 was not something that limited the presidential power. Typical of federal laws, it usurps the Constitution, which itself is a usurpation of the Articles of Confederation and is a usurpation of individual liberty and is forced on people. They usurped it by saying they're limiting the presidential power. They actually expanded the presidential power and circumvented Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution. Very clearly. It is inarguable. Here's a little bit more on the code. If you want to look it up, Legal Information Institute, the U.S. Code, federal aid to state governments. Whenever there is an insurrection in any state against its government, the president may, upon the request of its legislature or its governor, if the legislature cannot be convened, call into federal service such of the militia of the other states in the number requested by the state and use such of armed forces as he considers necessary to suppress the insurrection. Now that is simply a reiteration and rewording of what is in the Constitution. But here is the next part of the code, something they added, which is completely contrary to the Constitution. Whenever the president considers that unlawful obstructions, combinations, or the president considers when unlawful obstructions, combinations, or assemblages or rebellion against the authority of the United States, that is the federal central government, make it impracticable to enforce the laws of the United States in any state by the ordinary course of judicial proceedings, he may call into federal service such of the militia of any state and use such of the armed forces. That's completely unconstitutional, completely, utterly, ridiculously contrary to the very foundational precepts of the Constitution of the United States. Right there. There is no arguing about that. It's right there. The Insurrection Act of 1807 did not limit the president in any way. It expanded the powers of the president. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Title 10, the United States Code. You want to look it up. You can check it all out. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important. And it goes back, obviously it's important because of what's going on today, but why is it historically important? How does it link back to illegitimate action by Washington, Hamilton, and a Supreme Court justice in 1794? Well, that has to do with the Whiskey Rebellion. The Whiskey Rebellion. This is a terrific book if you ever get a chance. The Whiskey Rebellion, Frontier Epilogue to the American Revolution. A great, great book. If you get a chance, I highly, highly recommend it. It's Thomas Slaughter is the author, and you'll see what happened. That Alexander Hamilton, who was Treasury Secretary under George Washington, and by the way, he got that through glad handling and having special favors pulled. He didn't know anything about finance, as is very clear. He didn't know anything about economics, but he knew a lot about political gamesmanship and friends. He was one of the big pushers for the Constitution to push out the Articles of Confederation. And one of the ways he was able to do this was he appealed to people who held U.S. Revolutionary War bonds. Those war bonds had become utterly worthless. And he was able to convince a lot of his friends who were involved with banking and speculation to buy those bonds up at pennies on the dollar from very poor farmers who had invested to try to support the American Revolution. And the new government was not getting taxes from the states in order to pay back these war bonds. The states were defaulting on their debts, and so the federal government, under the Articles of Confederation, was not paying back the war bonds. Well, Hamilton, in the plotting way that he was so famous for, to leave a preposition dangling, successfully convinced a lot of these wealthy people to buy up these bonds and then pushed for a new government. Originally, there was not going to be a new constitution. They were simply going to revise the Articles of Confederation. But he pushed for a new constitution that would give them central taxing power, and he wanted a central bank, which he got for a while, by the way. They had an artificial central bank. They had a banking monopoly for a while under the Articles of Confederation, and that was a complete mess as well under Robert Morris. However, Hamilton successfully got these guys to buy the bonds, and then, once the Constitution was passed, the internal taxing power of the federal government was applied in an excise tax onto whiskey. It was an unequal tax. It was not proportioned equally, and it allowed the big Eastern whiskey makers to be able to pay a lot less for what they were putting out versus what some of the more rural whiskey makers were making. In fact, I'll show you a little clip of this towards the end of the video. It's terrific, and it comes via some wonderful folks over at Historical Spotlight. But right now, I'll give you this information from Murray Rothbard and the Mises Institute. The main distortion of the official view of the Whiskey Rebellion was its alleged confinement to 4 counties of western Pennsylvania. From recent research, we now know that no one paid the tax on whiskey throughout the American backcountry, that is, the frontier areas of Maryland, Virginia, North and South Carolina, Georgia, and the entire state of Kentucky. President Washington and Secretary Hamilton chose to make a fuss about western Pennsylvania precisely because in that region there was a cadre of wealthy officials who were willing to collect taxes. Now, just to let you know how corrupt this was, in this early 1790s, 1794 is when they moved on these guys. They tried to start the tax in 1791. I want to give you some information about how this happened. Remember, under the Constitution, the president, this is the rules of the Constitution now. I don't necessarily agree with this. Under the rules of the Constitution, the president can move inside states if the legislature of the state or the chief executive of the state ask for help to suppress violence and keep their Republican form of government against insurrection. Right? That's the Insurrection Act, again, was written in 1807, supposedly to restrict the powers of the president, but clearly it expanded the powers of the president. So how was it that Washington and Hamilton were able to move into Pennsylvania when the governor of Pennsylvania did not ask for their help and the legislature of Pennsylvania did not ask for their help? How? I'll tell you how. Justice James Wilson, who was one of the key pushers with the Federalists, along with Hamilton and Madison, at the Constitutional Convention, who came from Pennsylvania and was an associate justice appointed by Washington onto the court, the Supreme Court, he just declared that Pennsylvania whiskey makers who weren't paying the excise tax were in insurrection. And that was what Washington used as a rationale to march on those people in a completely contrary way than what is spelled out in the Constitution. It doesn't say when a Supreme Court justice says there is insurrection. They circumvented the Constitution. They marched on those people with an army larger than the size of the Army of the Potomac and had between 13,000 and 15,000 troops. Unbelievable. Finally, Minneapolis cops shoot paintballs at people standing on their own front porch. This one is absolutely stunning. And for the opener, I want to just mention, again, hats off to Brian Young of High Impact Vlogs. I'm going to refer to Brian in just a minute. But right now, I want to refer to Tanya Kerson. Tanya Kerson was the one who got this footage and put it out there. This is from a suburb of Minneapolis. And it shows you, just like Brian says, they are under martial law. And I want you to think about something as you watch this. In fact, I'll mention it afterwards. Just watch this footage.
Oh, there's more. Look at this. They just keep coming.
Go! Go inside! Get inside! Get inside! Get inside! Get in your house now! Let's go! Light him up! Go inside now! Get in the house!
Get in, get in, get in, get in, get in, get in. Get in.
Oh, God, that hurt.
You good? Are you okay?
Right on the fucking crotch.
Are you okay? You got hit?
I'm good. They're fucked for that, dude. What?
Okay.
Okay. Folks, as Brian says, this is martial law, and it's not law. This is lawlessness, which is the state. This is the face of the state rising up and smiling and spitting in their faces. Their tax money was used to fund all this crap. And as I mentioned in one of the Liberty Conspiracy Timeless Knowledge Nuggets, this is precisely the kind of thing that I tried to warn people about, to leave a preposition dangling. The enemy is here. It's within your city. It's within your locality. Don't ever, ever think that your local police officers are always going to side with you, because they have other incentives, financial incentives, and they have training that tells them to do otherwise. Imagine this, and this is what I was going to mention before. Imagine these people are under a curfew, and they have already been told by their governor that they can't go out for how many weeks now? How many days? 70-something days likely in Minnesota. The only way they can go out of their homes under this cowabunga crackdown that has preceded this riot crackdown is if they can go to a job that has been deemed worthy by the agents of the state in order to make a little bit of money to pay for their food and pay the state to continue funding these people and pay the state so the state doesn't take away their home at which they were staying and on which they were standing, their own property. These people are trapped under house arrest by the state and only allowed to leave if they are going to work to get money to give to the state to continue to imprison them. Incredible. Absolutely incredible. And I want to turn to Brian as a way to invite you again to go to High Impact Vlogs. Please visit High Impact Vlogs. He already has tons of subscribers, of course, but he's awesome. Brian's the man. He's just freaking great. So he went and found the CBS Minnesota affiliate and he noted this. Watch how they report this. And I'm only going to give you a couple seconds because this is Brian's stuff. I hope you will go there. Watch this. Great job, Brian.
This on this news story right here. This is from CBS Minnesota. The title of the article is "Light 'em Up." Video appears to show law enforcement shooting paint rounds at Minneapolis residents on their porch. This is martial law, by the way. Martial law.
Right.
This is coming to us via Twitter. This is coming from the Whittier neighborhood. I don't know if there's sound on it or not, but these are police officers moving through the streets of the Whittier neighborhood.
Oh, I did see this. This is...
Get inside! Get in your house now! Let's go! Go inside now! Get in the house!
Those are pirates. Mafia.
Get in, get in, get in, get in, get in, get in.
God, that hurt. You good?
Are you okay?
Right on the cross.
Are you okay? You got hit?
I'm good. They're for that, dude.
So we'll replay it, but you can get an idea of just how serious people are, where they're literally walking down the street, and if you pay attention, you'll hear the police say, "Get in the house." You'll hear several commands, and then you'll hear, "Light them up," and then that's when you get the fire.
You would expect this in Russia. You would expect this in communist China, but this is happening in the supposed land of the free, home of the brave. This is not the land of the free, home of the brave. It hasn't been in a long time. It's the land of the fee and home of the slave.
Well said, Brian. Well said. All right, everybody, I'm going to wrap this up, but as I do, I will leave you with this. Again, please visit High Impact Vlogs if you want some great, ethically, morally, principally, logically based analysis all day long. He's putting videos out. The guy is a dynamo. He is just a machine, and he's awesome. Please go to High Impact Vlogs. Now, as we finish off, I'll give you this little bit from Historical Spotlight. Very good, based on material written by Tom DiLorenzo and Murray Rothbard and a few others, such as the book that I showed you before, The Whiskey Rebellion, Frontier Epilogue to the American Revolution. Here's a little bit about what George Washington did thanks to Alexander Hamilton and a corrupt Supreme Court justice.
The American War for Independence had taken a severe toll on the new nation. From the opening shots at Lexington and Concord, through the grueling winter at Valley Forge, and ending with the triumphant victory at Yorktown, Americans paid for the war in blood. 7 years after the war, Americans were still paying with their treasure. Following the ratification of the new Constitution, the United States federal government found itself burdened with an excessive amount of debt. Years of fighting a war with England had caused the United States to owe bondholders and others approximately $54 million. This would be comparable to a U.S. national debt of $4.1 trillion in 2009 by relative share of GDP. The states themselves had amassed a debt of approximately $25 million. In order to manage this debt and make the country fiscally stable, the first Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, in his first report on public credit, proposed a solution. First, in order to make the federal government appear credit-worthy, the existing debt would have to be paid. He urged Congress to consolidate all existing federal and state debt into a single debt that would be funded by the federal government. Revenue to satisfy this debt would be raised by issuing bonds. No surprise there. Governments seemed to be content with creating more debt to pay existing debt. The interest on the new debt would be paid by tariffs and an excise tax. Congress approved Hamilton's proposal in June and July 1790. The initial reaction to this measure caused a massive speculation in previously issued war bonds. Speculators with inside knowledge of the plan, knowing that the government would pay full face value of the bonds, combed the states looking for unsuspecting bondholders to sell their bonds for pennies on the dollar. Economist Thomas DiLorenzo writes, "Everywhere men with capital were feverishly pushing their advantage by preying on the ignorance of the poor. New York newspapers speculated that Robert Morris stood to make $18 million, more than $300 million in today's dollars, while Governor George Clinton of New York would pocket $5 million. Hamilton himself purchased some of the old bonds through buying agents in Philadelphia and New York, but insisted that they were for his brother-in-law. The key to Hamilton's proposal was the excise tax. Hamilton knew that current revenues from tariffs were insufficient to pay the interest on the new debt. The plan needed additional revenue to work. Hence, an excise tax, a tax on goods produced within the country, would solve this problem. At Hamilton's urging, Congress passed the Whiskey Act in March 1791. This act taxed the production of distilled spirits. It became the first tax levied on a domestic product by the federal government. The new tax was not well received, especially in parts of western Pennsylvania. Many refused to pay the tax. Protests and demonstrations ensued. Some tax collectors were reportedly tarred and feathered. Some statesmen, such as Secretary of State Edmund Randolph and the first Attorney General of the United States, urged negotiations between the federal government and the Pennsylvanians. However, when local courts refused to convict tax delinquents, Alexander Hamilton urged George Washington to quell the protest. Subsequently, a 13,000-man army containing many conscripts was created and led by Washington for the purpose. This army was larger than most armies fielded by Washington during the entire Revolutionary War, and it would be the first and only time a sitting American president led an army against his own people.
I'll stop that there. Just to go back to our stories, and I'll wrap things up with a few details from my MRC TV piece. Again, we go back. Minneapolis cops shoot paintballs at people standing on their own front porch. Disgusting. Number 2, Trump to send U.S. troops into cities and states under the Insurrection Act of 1807. Again, supposedly, we're told by contemporary websites that it was written to limit the power of the president regarding using troops inside the United States. When we actually look at it, we see that it expanded the power in an unconstitutional fashion. The Constitution requires state legislatures or the governor of the state to ask for federal troops to be brought in. This was not done in the Whiskey Rebellion. They relied on a Supreme Court justice, a friend of Alexander Hamilton's, appointed by George Washington, to declare that there was insurrection in Pennsylvania. And finally, we have this towering, incredible anti-constitutional action by John Roberts, about which I will turn to my piece from for MRC TV. It's available now if you want to go to it, mrctv.org. If you follow me on Twitter, you probably have seen my tweets about it. This is as absurd and infuriating as that 2012 Obamacare ruling, relying not on any single word. Really, folks, I read Roberts' decision that he wrote and released for Friday night. And there is literally not a single word of reference to the U.S. Constitution at all in the entire decision. And it's very brief. You can read it. In fact, I've got it hyperlinked in here somewhere. I can't remember. Oh, here it is. This is the hyperlink right here. As I mentioned, the issue is that since March 19th, when Gavin Newsom issued his stay-at-home decree, churches and other places of worship in California have been prohibited from operating as their pastors and congregations chose. Even now, after Newsom on May 25th beneficently blessed the churches with permission to congregate with no more than 100 people spaced apart as he dictates, maybe have to be on your head. These religious Americans are being restricted in their free practice of their beliefs, And against Newsom's commands, and after being insultingly rebuffed by the Federal Ninth Circuit, it was actually a panel of the Federal Ninth Circuit, South Bay United Pentecostal Church and numerous others on May 23rd asked the Supreme Court for emergency injunctive relief. But treating the plaintiffs like romper room children, the majority composed of Roberts, Ginsburg, Kagan, Sotomayor, and Breyer dispelled the immense problems of Newsom's crackdown, first pointing out something that wasn't even pertinent, the difference between an injunction and a stay. It has nothing to do with it. They just start talking about a stay. Well, this is different than a stay. Nobody's talking about a friggin' stay, you morons. It's an injunction because they're being injured by the state. How tough is it to figure this out? For God's sake. Roberts and his leftist cohorts, and this is key, and his leftist cohorts went on to offer this utter nonsense. Our Constitution principally entrusts the safety and health of the people to the politically accountable officials of the states to guard and protect. You see how they have the quotes there? As if they're quoting the Constitution? They're not quoting the Constitution. They aren't quoting the Constitution in any way. They're quoting a 1905 Supreme Court precedent, not the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't have any public health police power in it. The Constitution is based, supposedly, on Lockean natural rights theory, which is man-on-man violence is supposed to be protected and stopped by the government. Of course, the government is just men, and in order to supposedly protect you, they engage in violence. So it's circular. But that's neither here nor there. That's the anarchist argument right now. I'm just talking about the Constitution, which is what they're not citing. I said the text, this is the preamble. Some people try to turn to the preamble. I said the text itself, specifying the branches, enumerated powers, and amendments, lays out how they will, these are the goals that they intended in the preamble. Then the text itself, specifying the branches, enumerated powers, and amendments, lays out how they intended these goals to be achieved. And of course, by general welfare, they meant prosperity through voluntary market exchange, not redistribution of wealth, since that makes all residents potential targets for government tax theft and runs counter to the goal of ensuring liberty, justice, or the philosophical rationale for the state itself, that being property and liberty protection against attacks by other people. No, the current majority of the SCOTUS didn't cite a single word of the Constitution, literally not one word. They cited this, Jacobson v. Massachusetts, a case that saw the court invent a public health police power for states that doesn't exist at all. I will go into this in more detail if you were so inclined. I hope that you will watch my full video that should be released tonight or tomorrow by the good folks at MRC TV. And please tell your friends about it. I don't want to steal any of their thunder. This is the piece. You can head over there to MRC TV, check out the piece. It's just been released. I want to thank the team at MRC TV, and I want to thank you as we close things off. Please remember, everybody, it's extremely important. If you want this to continue and flourish, it's going to be up to us to tell people, literally a couple people a day, send them the links, ask them to subscribe, and send the links and ask others to subscribe. This is a key time, and I'm completely dedicated to freedom. There aren't too many things to really think about in life other than treating your neighbor properly and in a fashion that will allow your soul to not be tarnished. And the only way to do that, I believe, and I think it's provable, is to leave people in peace and to defend the principles of natural rights, not the state. And in every way, we try to break these down and offer people information, whether it's to understand the Constitution better and see how those politicians who swear oaths to operate under it completely circumvent it, which shows that it's not that strong a barrier against them, which shows that Spooner, Lysander Spooner, was right, the 19th century Massachusetts philosopher. And then we can go deeper into it, into real voluntarism, into real economics, into real voluntary exchange and moral association with others, ethical association with others. Morals is individual, ethics is morals in action with others, just to be philosophical. All right, I'm going to close up shop now. I hope that all of you have enjoyed what you've seen, And perhaps I'll break off part of this to be a long-standing knowledge nugget. Until next time, everybody, please remember, tweet these, get these out as much as possible to everybody. And again, thank you so much. Until next time, be seeing you.